Welcome back, I'm Bill. This little wedge, as they call them, is a Preway model 4521A, made by Prentiss Wabers in the 1940s. Lots of stove companies would come out with small versions of their suitcase stoves, and this was sort of Prentiss Wabers. I don't know if it was an economy model specifically or just meant to be particularly small. It is quite small. You can pick it up and you can see it's wedge shaped. Very compact. It's a really cool design. I'll show you how this works. This is the third iteration of this model. There were four. There was a 401, and then when they changed their model number scheme, they went to the 4521. This is a 4521A, and then later there would be a 4821. And through those, there were minor modifications made. The paint went from a lighter green to a darker green, and instead of a latch here, you've got this slider that opens up this way. The way the windscreens attach and hook here changed. The biggest difference is probably with the pump and the filler. So this opens up. We'll fold these out in a minute, but first what we want to do is level it. This, I guess it's a handle, when it's in use, folds down, and this levels it so it's no longer at an angle. We'll put up the grate. We'll take our stove tank out, and the stove tank hangs off and then has these little tabs here that hook on the legs to position it properly and to support it. In, and then we've got this great support that's hinged, and that comes down and kind of locks the tank in place, and that's ready to go. And we can fold out our windscreens, and they've got these little tabs here that clip into these tabs down here. On the earlier versions, they had a little hook, and they would just rest on the side of the case. So pretty neat. It's similar to a Coleman in some ways, dissimilar in others. The auxiliary control is here, and when it's down, it's on. When it's up, it's off. This needs to be tightened a little bit, I think, because it wants to flop down. They've got a similar instant lighting circuit, if you will, not too unlike Coleman's. But whereas Coleman's, you have that little lever that you flip up when it's in the heating or warm-up stage, that pushes down a wire that blocks the fuel pickup so that it won't flood. And because of that, it ends up sucking in air off the top of the tank because of the way the fuel and air tube is designed. And then when you flip that back down once it's hot, that allows the fuel to flow freely, and the fuel level inside the fuel and air tube equalizes with the tank, and it cuts off that air supply. These, you open this guy first, and all this is a valve that goes in. I'll show you once we get this out. On the underside of the valve, there's a little air hole, and that allows air that you've pumped into the tank to rush up. This valve lets it go into the generator, and then you open the main valve, which allows fuel to go in. And the two sort of equalize, so you get a lot of air with the gasoline, and that prevents it from flooding. But you do have to make sure, on a Coleman, if you don't turn that lever down, it's not the end of the world. On this, if you don't close this valve, you'll let all the air out of the top of the tank, and you'll have to keep pumping it up. This is one of the things that did change over the years on these. Get this out. The early ones had a separate filler cap and a separate pump. On the 4521A and the 4821, the pump and the fuel cap are all part of the same assembly. So if I can get this unscrewed here, there we go. So we've got our pump here, which is pretty much the same as like a Coleman stove pump. What's different is instead of a check valve in the bottom of the tank, we have a non-return valve at the bottom of the pump tube. So, and we've got an O-ring here, which this one amazingly is still soft and works. that seals the tank closed. And then when you pump this down, there's a spring-loaded pip in the bottom that we'll see when we take it apart. And so there's no positive shutoff on this like there is on a Coleman, where you screw down the air stem and shut off the check valve. This just has a non-return valve, and it seems to be working well. So just stick that in here for now. What's the history on these? Well, the first version was the Model 401. They had a Model 402 and a Model 403. The 1 seems to have been what they used to designate the small wedge-shaped stove, while the 2 and the 3 designated their suitcase stoves, the larger ones, 2 being for the 2-burner and 3 being for the 3-burner. There's a patent for this design from 1942. They may have started making these earlier than that, but this wedge stove design seems to be from the early 40s. So they probably made these just before the US entered the Second World War. After that, of course, they were put to work for military production rather than civilian production. And then after the war was over, they went back to civilian production, but Prentiss Wabers changed their model numbering scheme at that point. It went from the 401 to the 4521. 21 designated the wedge stove, 22 designated the 2-burner suitcase stove, and you can see, I'll throw a link up here above to the video I did about 1.5 years ago on restoring the 4522. And then the 4523 was the same thing, but longer and 3 burners. The 45 designated the year that model was introduced. So the 4521 was introduced in 1945. I guess that means the 4521A was introduced later in 1945. That might explain why 4521s are less common. 4521As would have been made for several years, because that's when, in 1948, the 4821, 4822, 4823 came out. So this was probably the model that they made for the longest time, other than perhaps the 4821, which I'm guessing they made into the 1950s. Let's set the tank aside for right now, and we'll concern ourselves with all of the rest of this. These are held together in many cases with just sheet metal tabs that have been bent and curled around things. So what I want to do is bend them as little as I have to get pieces removed. Also, there are a few things that I have already done to this in advance of working on this, like 1.5 months in advance. I decided to put some deep creep on the burner cap screws, because these are notoriously frozen and will usually snap off. So in order to get underneath there, I had to remove this. And again, this is one of those parts that is held in with these rolled over, bent over tabs. So if I perhaps I should start with the grate, but I'm not going to. So yeah, this is just held into these brackets with these bent tabs, and then there's a tab in the back that slides into the back here. So you know what, let's set the manifold aside for now too, and let's work on this guy. So this is this steel here is spot welded in, so the handle / support is not going to come off. The manifold supports are also, this is spot welded in, so that won't come apart. But what we can do is take off the lid, and I think that's where I'm going to start. And again, this is the same as the 4522 that I did about 1.5 years ago. We just have to fold or bend these out. They're probably difficult for you to see with the grate in place. Something a little bulkier, assuming it'll even get in there. just have to give it a little bit of a pry. Let's see what happens if I can get the other side loosened up. You try to bend this out, but then you've got these tabs in the way as well. Yeah, these are not easy to get into. Okay, different tack. Let's get the grate off first. So the grate is held in with these 4 tabs here. The first thing I'll try is just to, I think that's going to be quite a bit easier. So, I want to bend these as little as I have to, because they will get painted, and then after they're painted, we'll have to put them back without scratching them. Okay, well, while we're at it, we might as well take the support off. You may, this will be fun. We're going to have to bend these up, and probably quite a bit because we've got this here. I think the middle one we may be able to get away with flexing things. That give us enough clearance. Yes, it does. That one. Okay. That's 2 things free. Now maybe we can get in here to these hinges a little bit more easily. Problem is one side is behind these. There's not much room to play with. Really is zero play in any of this. There we go. There we go. Once that's free. Okay, so here's our bottom. That's it. Again, this is on there. Everything else is on here permanently. Looks like I may have bent this a little bit getting that off. Now the windscreens are held in place with these brackets on the side, and these we can fold up until we're clear. We'll need a little bit of straightening on these. There's the other. Boy, that's really gross. And here's the lid. So I do have a reproduction decal for this when we're done. Let's take apart the manifold. We'll start with the burner caps, and hopefully these have loosened up. That sounds good. Okay. A little bit. Deep creep or PB blaster, whatever penetrating oil you've got, maybe even ATF and acetone. That plus time is your best friend on these old things. And if they resist a little bit, just screw them back, tighten them up a little bit, and then loosen them up again. There's going to be a asbestos seal around here. I'm going to leave that alone for now. On the 4522, I had some issues with that when it came time to replace it. So I'm going to leave it for now and see how it goes after the cleanup. You'll see this has a, we call it like a tappet or a poppet valve, similar to the like the Model 2, the Coleman Model 2, like the D series. It's just actuated with this guy. We'll take that apart in a minute. Let's see how these other screws are. If you've got something like this and you just tear into it and the screws are rusted and seized, just back off, give it some penetrating oil and some time. So that's the burner caps, and this guy I applied a bit of heat to as well. You can tell it's the parts here are brass. And this is the whole thing's turning. So there is a screw head in here. Note of the orientation of all these parts. So the bit that attaches to the actuator, and this is crimped in there, so we won't take this apart any more than it is. That goes on the outside, this goes through, and then we've got our little poppet deal here. This is crimped on, so that won't come apart anymore. And that is our manifold. Now, there's a little flap on the back here that can be bent out further, and this is the fresh air intake for the mixing chamber. So the generator feeds fuel vapor in here, fresh air comes in through this. It's meant to be adjustable, and one thing I caution, if the stove is running, which I've already had this running and it runs great, I'm not going to mess with this, because again, my experience with that 4522, it was a bear to get this adjusted properly after it got squeezed together during the cleanup process. And now our tank, so we already had this part out. Go ahead and unscrew the pump. There's our wing nut, or whatever you want to call that. There's a nut on the end here. To turn. I think we're just going to have to risk getting some jaw marks on there. Because that is really tight. Let me put some penetrating oil on that and see if that makes a difference, and we'll come back to it. The rest of this is just the non-return valve down at the bottom. This is a little different than a Coleman. On a Coleman, this is knurled, and you can grab onto it with some I use some pliers with electrical tape wrapped around them so it doesn't mar anything. And those are really easy to grab hold of, but that doesn't do anything when there's nothing knurled or rough to grab hold of here. Okay, so there's the outside of our non-return valve. There's the spring. And here's the pip. And it looks like rubber. It could be cork. It's actually working, so I'm hesitant to mess with it, but we'll see how things go. I may cut a new one. For now, we'll just set all of this aside. Now for the generator and valve. Again, in anticipation of taking this apart, I've applied some heat to where the generator meets the valve, and I've also applied some heat to the generator where it meets the bung, because I don't want anything to snap off. It's only happened to me once, but especially on this older stuff that's kind of rare. Oh wow, I'm amazed. This thing's seen a lot of use, and yet the spring came right out of the generator tube. That's really surprising. Let's get our gas tip off. So I know this guy, maybe someone had this apart at some point, because the very first time I fired this up, it ran great. The second time it kept flooding on me, and I pulled the tank off and immediately noticed that the gas tip was screwed in about half a turn. Somehow it had worked itself out, and was dribbling fuel down into the mixing chamber. As I recall, from the other one of these I took apart from here, this is basically the same as a Coleman. Our cleaning rod just threads into the front end of the valve stem. And the knob is permanently, I think it's press fit onto the valve stem, and there isn't really a way to get that off without doing any damage, so I'm going to leave this as it is. When I put this in citric acid, I'll put these two valves back on to protect the graphite packing inside, which still seems to be good on these. And this is our air control. Oh, that was loose. This is Prentiss Wabers' equivalent of the little up to light lever. It doesn't work quite the same way. Rather than restricting fuel, this lets air in. And now to get this out, it kind of looks to me like maybe at some point someone tried to get this out. And I suspect that because it looks like the generator was loose or something. Because this is slightly flattened here, but not enough that it damaged the threads where the generator screws in. But I'm definitely not going to put a wrench on either of these threaded pieces to try to turn this out. A Coleman, I can grab the top part, the square, and use that to turn it. This is probably the most likely place to put a wrench on it, but again, somebody has already flattened this. It looks like maybe it came out of the mold that way, but I doubt it. So I am going to quickly go off camera, and what I'm going to do is take this T and put it in a vise gently, because I still don't want to mess up this, but I'm hoping after having heated this a while back, and the fitting will be loose, any gunk that's in there that would have kept it tight will be gone, and I can just put it in my vise this way, clamp it in here, and turn it without doing any damage. So I'll be right back in a moment after doing that. I wasn't sure it would, but I've dinged up this just a little bit, but not enough to cause any actual damage. It's just cosmetic, it's scratched, but I can now get this out. I was hoping we could get it out. If I had to leave it in, I know that it's not clogged, but I'd still like to clean the fuel pickup. So this is our fuel pickup. This is a screen down here on the bottom. unscrew from the valve first. And this is our valve body, so the fuel pickup goes into that larger hole, and unlike a Coleman where you've actually got fuel and air feeding up through the fuel and air tube into the bottom of the valve, this has a separate hole for the air, and when you open this valve, air just simply rushes in through that. It works just as well as the fuel and air rod or fuel and air tube on a Coleman. The only downside is on this, like I said earlier, if you forget to close that valve, it will bleed off all of the air in the top of the tank, whereas a Coleman is designed so that once you've got the fuel unrestricted, the fuel level equalizes inside that fuel and air tube, and it cuts off the air, the escaping air. It doesn't feel like it's loosening, but it is turning. I don't know why it's so tight. It's still too tight for me to turn by hand, but I can see it's unthreading. Now, boy. Taken apart a few Prentiss Wabers, and I've never had one like that. They're all basically the same. But that was tight all the way down to the very last turn. So we'll make sure that's all cleaned up before we put it back together. But that's our fuel pickup tube. There's no tip, it's just open, and then it's got the screen over the bottom. Now, let's try to get this apart again. This way, but yeah, that is the tightest one I've ever encountered. I'm scratching it. Let's see here. It's interesting. It's got like a star washer underneath it, which I've never seen before. That may not be helping. So I'm going to let this soak. We may not take it apart any more than this. I think we should be able to eventually, but I may just have to clean it as it is and keep that leather out of the cleaning solution. We'll see. So from here, all of these small parts are going to go into all of this into a citric acid bath for cleaning. They will then be polished. Some of them may be wire wheeled. The manifold will go into the electrolysis tank, as will the tank and these other parts to strip the paint off. I'll do this off camera, I will probably do a little bit of degreasing on these. If you add lye to your electrolysis tank, it'll help get rid of that grease, or it will just get rid of it. It won't help. It will just get rid of it, but then you have to be careful where you dump it out. I like to dump my e-tank out on the lawn, and the lawn loves it, but not if you've got lye in it. So, I will see you either in the kitchen or at the electrolysis tank. Here I've got one of the windscreens in the small e-tank, and it's definitely stewing away. And next door over here in the big e-tank, I've got the lid, and it's bubbling a bit too. Not as much, but it'll take a bit longer. But I'll check on these tomorrow. I've got all of the smaller parts stewing away here on the stove, brass on the left and steel and nickel-plated parts on the right. They're in a solution of about 1 teaspoon of citric acid power to a liter of water, and I'll let these cook away for 20, maybe 30 minutes. I'll come back and check on them periodically. The brass valve body is over there by itself. I don't want to damage the graphite packings, which the citric acid will do if they're exposed to it too long. So I'm going to clean up the main valve body, and then I will attach the 2 valve stems and knobs, those assemblies, once the valve stem is cleaned up, and I'll let them have a much less aggressive soak, just enough to loosen things up, and then they'll get some steel wool or wire brush. Right, our parts are coming out of the citric acid, so I'm just going to rinse them off with clear water.
rub them down with some fine 4/0 steel wool. I've got a brass wire brush if necessary, and I've also got some round brushes just to clean out the insides.
Here's the bottom part of the case as it's come out of the electrolysis tank. This is why I like electrolysis. You can see how easily this comes off. Everything's out of the electrolysis tank. I did try to film that coming out just so you could see how easily the paint comes off, and trying to film it one-handed just didn't work. So I've made sure all the paint is gone. I've lightly scuffed the case pieces with some 80 grit sandpaper. I've done a little bit of straightening on the windscreens where they were bent. And on the tank, I've actually sanded this quite thoroughly, first with 80 grit and then with 150, and then I wet sanded with 400. I'm not sure if that was necessary, but I kind of wondered why the paint was so weird on the tank. It's like the paint was there, but it wasn't what it was supposed to be like. It had almost turned black and was very, very grainy feeling, almost like it had come off. When I put it in the e-tank, it actually came off in nice layers like you would expect, but I figured out underneath the entire tank is tinned. So it's got this very soft tin coating all over it, and I think somehow the paint just, that worked through the paint, or the paint didn't adhere to it the way it normally does. I'm not sure what. So hopefully modern paint will work better on that, but because that tinning is so soft, it had lots of scratches and gouges in it. It had some places where It had dripped and run and was very thick, so I've sanded those out. It's not perfectly smooth. It'll still show some of that tinning texture under the paint like it did when it was new, but hopefully it'll be a little smoother than it was before. The primer has cured, so I'm going to wet sand this before I spray the color coat on. I'm pretty sure this is going to look better than it probably did from the factory. Again, there was like a tin coating all over this, and it's very soft and easily scratched. I tried to sand some out. I didn't want to be too aggressive, but I think this is smoother than it probably ever was. And hopefully the primer phase here and sanding the primer will make that even better. You can still see there's some I don't know what to call it, lines, perhaps where something was grabbed this and took it out of a tank. And I have sanded a bit, but not completely. I didn't want to make it perfect since it wasn't perfect to begin with. So I'm using 1000 grit sandpaper. I think anything between 600 and 1000 is good. And I'm just going to sand it. After priming it, I can feel it's a little bit rough. So find a logical place to start on this and just start sanding. Use plenty of water. And just do that until it feels smooth and there's no more drag. I think that's good, so I'm just going to clean all this off, and I'll wipe it down with a dry rag and then use some methyl hydrate on it to make sure it's perfectly clean and grease free, and we'll be ready for our color coat, at least on this. We've got the rest of the stove to sand. So this is our color coat on the tank. I'm just using a trim clad brown.
For the color coat on the stove body, I'm using this Premier Meadow Green. It seems to be a pretty dead close match, particularly in sunlight. This is Canadian Tire's in-house brand, if you're wondering about the name. It's not something I was familiar with until very recently. So I'll spray on 2 thin coats and then another coat on top of that, most likely.
The manifold and burner caps have been stewing away in here for about 2 days. So we'll pull this out and you can kind of see stuff's peeling off of there. Actually kind of suggests this may have been painted, which is really weird because it didn't look like it had been painted, but I clean this off and we'll see what it looks like. Well, let's put this back together. I've had a little bit of a start here. I was trying to remember, this is only the second one of these that I've worked on, and dealing with these hinges in the back, they're kind of a pain until you figure out that working at them from the back makes it a lot easier. So to figure that out, I had to put it back together. So these hinges are back together, and I'm going to have to touch up the green paint there just a little bit where it chipped off as a result of that. So the stove's already back together in this regard. So the next thing we want to do, I think, is put the manifold back in. I'm probably going to have to do some touch-up on these tabs as well. So we've got our manifold here, and the first thing I want to do is put this guy back together. So we've got this, we've got our nut, and we've got a screw. That's the big one here, and there's a spring here somewhere. So let's stretch this out just a little bit, I think. No, maybe it doesn't want to. So we'll flip this guy over, and our pop it. Goes in there. One thing I showed you, I took this out of the electrolysis tank and it looked like it had paint coming off of it. It didn't look painted before, especially around here. It looked like this is nickel plated. This part is cast iron. This is stamped steel. I've seen a few of these myself. I've never seen one that looked like it was painted. The other one that I've restored, the 4522, was just like this. It didn't have any hint that there was ever paint on it. I've looked at photos online and I can't find any that look like they're painted, other than maybe one or two that look like someone painted them with silver paint after the fact. So I don't know if that was just crud and grease that built up and it came off like paint. I don't know. It really did look like paint, but I can't find any examples that are painted that brown or black color. So I'm not going to repaint it. I'm going to put it back together as it is. So we've got this guy here, and this goes into the little groove. This screw goes through from this side. Let's see what I'm doing here. There we go. All right. And then this spring goes on here. And this square nut. Hoping you can see that. And we need to snug that up until this action, actually that's not bad, but it should be tighter than that. I think that's actually pretty good. So we can see up is closed, down is open. When it's actually installed in the stove, it'll never actually go down that far, but it doesn't actually need to. It just needs to open a little bit. Now, for burner caps, I made a point of not scraping everything out of here. I've got this gasket material left, and we'll see what we can do with it. What I really should do is get a sheet of, you can buy like 8.5 by 11 sheets of fireproof gasket material. It's about 1/8 of an inch thick, and cut your own custom size. I can't find anything around here to buy. All I can find is on the internet, and I just kind of want to get this put together. So I'm going to do the best I can with what I've got, and if it doesn't work, I might do that. I'm probably also, we'll see how this goes in place, but I've also got this gasket adhesive it's designed to put fiberglass braid gasket in like wood stove doors, but it's also pretty good at sealing stuff. It kind of makes a little bead and you can use it to seal stuff. So the main thing is, if this gasket isn't there, instead of coming out the top, the flame can escape out the sides. So what I'm thinking is, if we can get this in here, like that, there's still a little bit left down in these cracks and crevices. So if I can see that there's enough here, I think it'll still seal. So what I want to do is get these bits and pieces up here. Where there's little or nothing left. And hopefully we can hold it in place while I'm putting the screws in. 4 screws. Put these in first and then get these holes lined up. I think that'll probably seal. This one's got a little burr on it. Doesn't want to just fall through. Seems to be tight. Hopefully that'll work. Now, I need to put this back in place. Like I said, these tabs just fold over. So we'll get this centered as best we can in the back here with this tab. And then push that down. And I'm going to leave all of these as they are just in case I need to move this some more, because the next thing we want to do is get the grate in place. So we'll put this guy on first. Bend all of these little tabs. So as you can see, even with some taped up pliers, my fresh paint's all scratched up. So let's do some more of this tab bending. Put this in place. There. I need to figure out how best to get a grip on this. Maybe if we put it this way. Seems to be working. Push that one down.
let's put these screens on. So we know this hooks in here, so this is going to go on this side. I think maybe we should lay this down. That way. Side and it doesn't seem right to me how this is working, but because of the way these tabs then sit inside like this, but this has to be how it goes. Oops, because those have to hook on there. This goes in here, so that's right, it just doesn't seem like it. That. So that will close. Let's see, they flex. Just like that. So let's set this aside and we'll work on our tank. So first things first, let's take care of the generator. There's a generator tip. Here's our valve, and there's our generator tip. So this guy is our air valve. Goes on there. Oh, that's too tight. That should be good. And this guy goes here, but I think I'm going to wait to put this on until we've got it in the tank, because I don't think there's enough clearance for that knob. So before we screw that in, we also need to put our fuel pickup together. So this was the one that was a real bear to get apart. Still being a bear, for whatever reason, this thing required pliers right down to the very last turn to unscrew it, and it's going to require pliers to get it back together. Okay. Now this screws into the larger of these two holes. And
snug. Okay. Not going to fall out. And we'll put some Permatex Blue. This is thread sealant, not thread locker. I'll just put a little bit on here. Just in case there's an issue with its sealing. And into the fount we go. That's straight. Okay, that looks perpendicular. Now we'll put the main valve in. Spring on. Still kind of amazed at how clean this generator is. And our tip. Make sure that that's snug. Since it was ready to fall off before I worked on this first time. Let me go ahead and put the pump back together. I wanted to make sure everything was aligned properly first, but I think we can put the pump back together. Lots of little pieces for this pump. Okay, let's put our inner V back together. I decided not to replace this, whatever it is. When this was in the citric acid, it really rehydrated, and it's looking really good now, so I don't think it's going to be an issue. So I'll just drop that in, drop our spring onto it, and then screw in the bottom. And that's good. Now for our pump, so we've got our cap, our spring, and then got our backer plate, got our pump cup, and it's got this little star washer that's kind of weird. I've never seen anything like that on one of these. I don't know if it was added or not, but I'll go ahead and leave it. All right, now let's oil that before we put it all back together. I'm going to use some 3-in-1 oil. Use neat's foot oil. You can use motor oil. Pretty much anything that other than a vegetable-based oil. Vegetable-based oils will go rancid and get sticky and cause the leather to harden, and it's a mess. So just push that down into there. And screw the cap on. And I just realized I need to have this on first. This guy on first. Then now screw the cap on. And our NRV is working nicely. We'll just thread that in. Okay. And we'll pull our stove up, put the support down. Before we put those out, let's go ahead and put our windscreens out. There we go. And put the stove on, or the tank on. It sits nicely there, and then this guy sits on top of that. So that's that. Everything looks like it's lined up properly. The last thing we have to do is I've got a nice reproduction decal to put up here. Let me wash my hands so they're clean for that process. And and before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and bend these tabs back as well, and then we'll get that decal. Okay, I've got my reproduction decal here in water. This came from Old Coleman Parts. They sell reproduction decals for most of these Preway models. Okay, it looks like we're getting there. So let's just put this up here. And off it comes. Looks like it's centered and about where it should be. All right, and I won't bore you with doing some little toothpick touch-ups with the paint here. While I was washing my hands, I went ahead and got our stove tank gassed up. So there we go. So we're actually ready to fire this up. I just need to pump it up. All right, so the first thing we want to do is make sure that this lever is up. That makes sure that the secondary burner is closed. We will pump this up. Should be enough. There's no positive shut off. We just pump it up. Make sure that's closed. We open our air valve first. It shouldn't do anything until we've got the main valve open, because this is sealing the fuel point up here. So just apply our flame. There we go. Let that run for a little bit, and the generator should heat up. Well, there it goes. That was fast. We can go ahead and close our air valve here. Replace the air that we lost. And now we can light our secondary. There we go. That looks great. I can see that I do have just a little bit of gas leakage here. So I probably will seal that up with some of this sealant. It doesn't look like it's really enough to be a problem, but it probably wouldn't hurt. I might also have something leaking down here. It's hard to say. Let's turn off the lights and close the garage door and have a look at this in the dark.
Well, there we go. That looks great. It looked like I was seeing little leaks here and there around the perimeter on the auxiliary, but with the lights up, I'm not seeing them anymore. I don't know if maybe it just needed to run for a little bit or what, but I'm pretty happy with that. I think that looks pretty good. These have a neat flame pattern with those grates. So, thanks for watching. I appreciate it, and I will see you next time.